Have you ever played Oregon Trail or watched Western movies with those iconic covered wagons rolling across the prairie? We often romanticize this journey, but the reality was far more grueling. Before cars, trains, or planes, these wagons were the only way to head west, and it was a trip filled with pain, danger, and discomfort. Let's explore 20 incredible truths about what life was really like inside those covered wagons. Months of misery. The first truth, and perhaps the foundation for all other hardships, is the mind-numbingly long travel time. Covered wagons moved incredibly slowly, even in the best conditions, on flat terrain and with favorable weather. A wagon might cover about 20 miles, 32 kilometers, a day. But that was the ideal scenario. More often, they averaged between 8 to 20 miles daily. Rough terrain, mountain passes, or bad weather could slow them to a crawl. For example, if you started from St. Louis, a common jumping-off point for westward journeys, the as-the-crow-flies distance to San Francisco is roughly 1,750 miles. Even at the optimal 20 miles a day, theoretically, you'd still need nearly 90 days to reach San Francisco. However, that's just theoretical. In reality, wagons rarely maintained that pace. There were constant delays, broken wheels, sick or exhausted animals, bad weather, or terrain that was just too difficult. Moreover, the actual trails were much longer than the direct route, winding around obstacles and adding hundreds, even thousands of miles to the journey. As a result, a trip from St. Louis to the West Coast typically took around 6 months. 6 months of grueling travel, facing the elements, with limited food and amenities. It was a perilous adventure. Many people fell ill, were injured, and sometimes even died along the way. Reaching the West Coast was a monumental achievement, a testament to the pioneers' resilience and determination. They paid a heavy price in time and hardship for a chance at a new life. The wagon was a constant shaking box. When preparing for the journey west, pioneers had a few main wagon options. The most common type was the prairie schooner. From a distance, their curved canvas covers looked like a schooner's sails, hence the nickname. These were the 19th century equivalent of a minivan, used to transport families and their possessions across vast distances. They were designed for long journeys to the West Coast, but the ride was anything but comfortable. Another option was the Conestoga wagon, larger and heavier than the prairie schooner, often pulled by teams of up to 6 horses. However, its size and weight made it unsuitable for long cross-country journeys. Conestogas were more often used for shorter trips, like moving from a city such as St. Louis to the Kansas or Oklahoma territories. Regardless of the wagon type, travel was incredibly challenging. There were no paved roads on the vast plains back then. The trails were mostly rough dirt paths, often just deeply rutted tracks. Harsh weather could turn these paths into treacherous bogs of mud. Wheels broke frequently, animals often became exhausted or injured, and wagons could get stuck, damaged, or even fall apart entirely. Amazingly, prairie schooners, while prone to tipping, were considered easier to manage than Conestoga wagons. Conestogas were much wider, larger, and longer, and their size made them more likely to tip over and slide off the trail. Many parts of the trail were simply too narrow for Conestoga wheels. The exhausting walk beside the wagon. Not only were the roads unpaved, but covered wagons also had absolutely no suspension system. Prairie schooners, the most common type, were notoriously bumpy. Their tall, narrow design made them unstable, and the wooden wheels and axles offered no cushioning whatsoever. Every rock and rut transmitted jarring jolts straight through the wagon. Passengers were thrown back and forth constantly, for hours, days, and weeks on end. To mitigate the relentless bouncing, many pioneers opted to walk alongside their wagons. But imagine walking hundreds, even thousands of miles across that rough terrain. It was incredibly exhausting and exposed them to the harsh elements. So, it was a tough choice: endure the brutal, bumpy ride or the arduous walk. Neither option was easy, and it highlights the sheer difficulty pioneers faced on their westward journey. Even with careful packing, placing heavier items at the bottom to reduce rattling, the ride remained incredibly difficult. This was truly a test of physical and mental endurance. If you had to choose between walking hundreds of miles or enduring a relentlessly bumpy wagon ride, what would you choose? No room to sleep inside the wagon. It's easy to picture pioneer families snuggled up cozy inside their canvas-covered wagons at night. After all, there's a canvas roof, right? It seems like a natural shelter. But the reality was quite different. These prairie schooners were packed full of everything a family owned, and the interior space wasn't that big to begin with, only about 4 feet wide and 9 to 10 feet long. Imagine a slightly oversized queen-sized bed. Now picture filling that space with all your worldly possessions. There simply wasn't enough room for people to lie down and sleep inside. So, most nights, families slept outdoors. They might spread blankets on the ground or set up a makeshift tent using canvas and poles. This offered only minimal protection from the elements. They had to endure scorching heat, freezing temperatures, rain, and wind. And if the weather turned truly nasty, they'd huddle under the wagon or even sleep on the hard ground beneath, seeking any shelter they could find. This made for uncomfortable and often restless nights. Not a recipe for a good night's sleep. And yes, it probably did a number on their backs. Bland, scant food, and strange fuel. So, you're heading west in your covered wagon. You've packed your belongings, your tools, everything you need for a new life. But what about food? You couldn't just pop into a grocery store on the Oregon Trail. Those prairie schooners and Conestoga wagons were tightly packed with household goods, not pre-made meals. That's where the chuck wagon came in. This was the mobile kitchen of the wagon train, similar in size to a prairie schooner, but specifically designed for food preparation and storage. It was essential for keeping families fed on their long journey. Chuck wagons featured a water barrel mounted on the side, providing easily accessible fresh water throughout the day. Many even had coffee grinders, offering a much-needed caffeine boost after a long day of travel. Underneath the chuck wagon was the possum belly, a storage compartment for firewood, and, more interestingly, dried buffalo dung, also known as cow chips. On the treeless plains, cow chips were a valuable fuel source for cooking fires. Each evening, the chuck wagon became the center of camp. Families gathered around as cooks prepared simple meals like beans, bacon, and biscuits. It was a time for sharing stories and building community, a welcome respite from a long day on the trail. No horse culture here, mules and oxen only. We often associate the Great Plains with horses and horseback riding. And it's true, many Native American tribes became master horsemen, using horses for hunting, warfare, and transportation. U.S. soldiers and explorers also used horses extensively. But there's one group of people almost entirely excluded from this horse culture: the settlers. For most pioneer families, owning a horse was simply too expensive. Horses were costly to purchase and required significant upkeep. Settlers were already stretched thin financially, buying their wagons, supplies, and provisions for their journey. A horse was a luxury they couldn't afford. Instead, they relied on mules and oxen. These sturdy animals were much more practical for the westward journey. Unlike horses, mules and oxen could survive on the coarse forage available along the trail, making them easier and cheaper to feed. They were also stronger and more durable, capable of pulling heavy wagons over vast distances and challenging terrain. Mules, known for their sure-footedness, were especially valuable in mountainous regions. Oxen, though slower, were incredibly strong and reliable, ideal for pulling heavy loads over long stretches. They became the primary work animals on the westward trails. Upon reaching their destination, settlers continued to rely on their mules and oxen for farming and other tasks. These animals became essential for building their new lives. Horses, while perhaps more glamorous, were simply impractical for the average pioneer family. The reliance on mules and oxen demonstrated the resourcefulness and practicality that characterized westward expansion. Insufficient weather protection. Weather was a constant challenge for pioneers traversing the western trails. Prairie schooners, with their canvas covers, offered only meager protection. The canvas itself wasn't waterproof. Settlers had to treat it to make it resistant to the elements. They started with thick cotton canvas, typically around 10 ounces. Then, they would coat it with linseed oil. This created a barrier against water, protecting the family's possessions from rain and light snow. Once treated, the canvas was carefully draped over the wagon's frame and secured. But even treated canvas wasn't perfect. On the vast plains, wind was a constant factor. Rain rarely fell straight down. Strong winds could blow rain sideways, right under the canvas cover. And when it wasn't raining, winds often kicked up clouds of dust and sand, blasting the wagon and penetrating every crevice. To combat this, settlers added a drawstring to the edges of the canvas. This allowed them to pull the canvas tight, creating a more enclosed space, like a giant hoodie for their wagon. It helped keep out wind, rain, and dust, offering a bit of extra protection against the harsh elements. But even with these precautions, extreme weather remained a constant threat. What about these weather challenges surprises you the most about the pioneer's journey? Constant wagon breakdown risk. Imagine this. You're traveling cross-country in a covered wagon, miles from anywhere. Suddenly, something breaks. No paved roads, no garages, no tow trucks. Just you, your broken wagon, and the wilderness. This was the reality for pioneers. Wagon breakdowns were a constant threat. The rough trails were incredibly harsh on the wooden vehicles. Wooden wheels cracked and splintered on rocks and uneven terrain. Axles snapped under the strain. Metal parts wore down and broke off. And when something broke, you were entirely on your own. So, pioneers loaded their wagons with essential tools: hammers, saws, axes, nails, anything they might need for repairs. They also carried spare parts, knowing that breakdowns were inevitable. But sometimes, even the best preparation wasn't enough. They had to improvise, using whatever materials they could find for repairs. A broken wagon meant halting the journey. Families had to unload everything, a back-breaking task. Often they even had to tip the wagon on its side to access the undercarriage for repairs. All of this happened while facing the elements, wildlife, and other potential dangers. Each successful repair was a hard-won victory, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. They were their own mechanics, relying on their skills and resourcefulness to overcome these continuous challenges. Treacherous river crossings. Sooner or later, every pioneer family heading west had to face a river crossing. Although much of the West was arid, rivers and streams still cut across the landscape, posing a serious challenge. These crossings were difficult for everyone: families, their animals, and their wagons. Sometimes, at larger rivers, ferries might be available, but ferries were expensive, and most settlers couldn't afford them. That meant they had to ford the rivers, driving their wagons straight through the water. A very risky proposition. At smaller rivers, pioneers often had to improvise, building rafts from whatever materials they could find. If they were lucky, there would be trees nearby, and they could lash logs together to create a makeshift ferry. The key was finding the right spot to cross. They needed a narrow section with a calm current. Once a promising location was found, they would attempt to waterproof the wagon box, coating it with wax and sealing any cracks. The wagon itself became a sort of boat, a very fragile one. Then, with their oxen pulling, they would slowly push into the current. A successful river crossing was a huge relief, but it was always a gamble. If the current was too strong or the wagon too heavy, it could easily tip over, spilling everything into the river. Animals could be swept away. People could be injured or even drown. River crossings were tense, dangerous moments, a stark reminder of the perils of the westward journey. Disease was the biggest killer. Just how dangerous was the Oregon Trail? It's hard to say for sure. Like the total number of emigrants, the number of deaths is difficult to pinpoint precisely. Estimates vary considerably. Some historians place the mortality rate at around 4 to 6% of all travelers. That would translate to roughly 12,000 to 24,000 deaths. Other estimates go as high as 10%. What was the biggest danger? Accidents and disease. Pioneer journals frequently mention accidental shootings, injuries from animal encounters, drownings, and deaths from exposure. Wagon accidents were also common, and tragically, children were sometimes severely injured after falling under moving wheels. Disease was a constant threat on the Oregon Trail. Hygiene was a massive challenge. Opportunities to bathe or wash clothes were rare, and clean drinking water was often scarce. Human and animal waste, along with trash and dead animals, often contaminated water sources. Cholera, a waterborne illness, was the biggest killer. Diphtheria, another infectious disease, was a leading cause of death in children. Weakened by exhaustion and poor nutrition, pioneers were also susceptible to illnesses like typhoid fever, mountain fever, likely tick-borne, dysentery, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, food poisoning, scurvy due to vitamin C deficiency, and alkali poisoning from contaminated water. Measles, mumps, and smallpox also took a heavy toll, especially among children. Childbirth on the trail also posed grave risks for women. The lack of proper medical care meant that even minor ailments could quickly become life-threatening. Sickness was a constant fear, and its presence cast a long shadow over the westward journey. Unexpected accidents and injuries. In addition to dangerous epidemics, pioneers also faced a myriad of other unexpected accidents and injuries on the Oregon Trail. Their journals frequently document terrifying incidents. Firearm accidents were a constant concern, with accidental shootings capable of causing serious injury or even death. Life in the wilderness also meant dangerous encounters with animals, from kicks by livestock to attacks by wild animals, leading to painful wounds. Drowning was a major risk, especially during river crossings, where a strong current or a misstep could sweep away people or possessions. Cold exposure was also a cause of death, as pioneers endured harsh cold without adequate shelter or warm clothing. Particularly tragic were wagon accidents, which were very common. With rough roads, no suspension, and bulky vehicles, it was not uncommon for wagons to tip over or for wheels to crush anything in their path. Tragically, children were sometimes severely injured or died after falling under the moving wheels of the wagon. These injuries were often untreatable due to the lack of medical care. The truth about Native American encounters. We often see movies depicting wagons circled for defense against Native American attacks. But in reality, conflict with Native Americans was relatively rare during the peak years of the Oregon Trail. Historian John Unruh's research suggests that fewer than 400 emigrants died from Native American attacks between 1840 and 1860. This number is tiny compared to the tens of thousands who died from disease and accidents during the same period. More often, interactions between pioneers and Native Americans were peaceful, even helpful. Native Americans frequently traded goods with pioneers, operated ferry services, or assisted with livestock management. While wagon trains often circled at night, the primary purpose of this was for livestock management, not for defense against attacks. In the rare instances when attacks did occur, wagons were usually in traveling formation, not a defensive circle. The Hollywood image of constant conflict does not reflect the more complex and nuanced reality of life on the Oregon Trail. However, tragically, many conflicts that did occur between pioneers and Native Americans were often instigated by the pioneers themselves. Cultural misunderstandings, arrogance, and violent acts against Native Americans, such as shootings, sometimes provoked retaliation. And often, this retaliation was not aimed at the specific group that caused the incident, but at the next wagon train that happened to pass by. After the 1850s, attacks on smaller wagon trains or individual travelers did increase. This rise in violence reflected growing Native American hostility towards white settlers, who were increasingly encroaching on their lands. The relationship between pioneers and Native Americans was complex and often strained, and the increasing pressures of westward expansion exacerbated these tensions. What about these truths changed your perspective on Native Americans and pioneers? The mental and emotional burden. Beyond the physical hardships and direct dangers, the wagon journey was also a huge mental and emotional burden for the pioneers. 6 months of continuous travel, facing uncertainty and lurking dangers every single day, created tremendous psychological pressure. They lived in a state of near existence rather than true living. Every morning they woke up. They didn't know what awaited them. It could be a dangerous river, a broken wheel, or a family member falling ill with no medicine. The fear of death was a constant companion, with thousands perishing on the trail. Isolation was also a huge factor. They were often hundreds of miles from any help. When the wagon broke down or someone got sick, they were entirely on their own. The pressure to self-repair, to care for the sick, while the entire wagon train continued moving or slowed down because of them, must have been immense. Nights spent sleeping outdoors, exposed to wind, rain, bitter cold, and the eerie sounds of the wilderness, didn't just cause back pain, but also wore down their spirits with insecurity. The despair of arriving at their destination with nothing left, hungry and sick, was also a huge psychological shock after such a grueling journey. All these factors turned the trip into a brutal test of human mental endurance, making every pioneer a living testament to incredible resilience. Poor hygiene and living conditions. Beyond the direct dangers of disease, poor hygiene and harsh living conditions were the underlying causes of many deadly illnesses on the Oregon Trail. Personal hygiene was a major challenge. Opportunities to bathe or wash clothes were extremely rare during the months-long journey. This led to the accumulation of dirt, bacteria, and foul odors, creating favorable conditions for pathogens to thrive. Clean drinking water was also frequently scarce. Water sources along the trail were often contaminated by human and animal waste, along with trash and dead animals. Using contaminated water was the primary cause of waterborne diseases, like cholera, the biggest killer on the trail. Additionally, pioneers were susceptible to other illnesses due to poor hygiene, such as dysentery, typhoid fever, and food poisoning. Malnutrition and exhaustion from the long journey also weakened their immune systems, making them more vulnerable to all types of illnesses. Wagon camps and tents, not regularly cleaned, also harbored insects and bacteria, contributing to the spread of disease. All these factors combined to create an incredibly unsanitary living environment where even minor injuries could lead to severe infections and death due to the lack of proper medical conditions. In your opinion, which hygiene factor was the hardest to maintain on the trail? Children were the most vulnerable. Of all those who faced the brutal Oregon Trail, children were among the most vulnerable, and the number of child deaths on the trail is a heartbreaking tragedy. While estimating the total number of deaths is difficult, pioneer journals frequently document the tragic deaths of young children. Children were especially susceptible to infectious diseases. Diphtheria was a leading cause of death in children on the trail. Additionally, diseases like measles, mumps, and smallpox also took a heavy toll on them, especially when their immune systems were weak and hygiene conditions were poor. The lack of clean water, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition made children easy targets for waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery. Besides disease, children were also frequent victims of accidents. With bumpy wagons and treacherous paths, wagon-related accidents were common. Sadly, children were sometimes severely injured or died after falling under the moving wheels of the wagon. These injuries were often untreatable due to the lack of medical care. Life on the trail was already harsh, but for children, it was an even more brutal test of survival, turning the dream of a new life into a nightmare for many families. Risks for women, especially during childbirth. Women on the Oregon Trail faced a separate and particularly terrifying set of risks, especially concerning childbirth. The lack of proper medical care on the trail meant that even the slightest complications during birth could quickly become life-threatening. Pregnant or recently delivered, women often had to continue the arduous journey in a weakened state. Constant travel, rough terrain, malnutrition, and poor hygiene increased the risk of infection, hemorrhage, and other complications. Without doctors or professional midwives, difficult births or those requiring medical intervention were hopeless. In addition to childbirth risks, women bore other burdens of trail life. They often had to perform heavy labor such as cooking, washing, childcare, and helping with wagon repairs, all while enduring their own fatigue and deprivation. The mental pressure was also immense as they faced the fear of losing loved ones, illness, and the constant insecurity of the journey. Isolation and being stranded in the middle of nowhere. Imagine this. You're traveling cross-country in a covered wagon, hundreds of miles from anywhere. Suddenly, something breaks. No paved roads, no repair garages, no tow trucks. Just you, your broken wagon, and the vast wilderness. This was the reality for pioneers. In that era, there were no maps indicating fuel stops or rest areas like today. If your wagon broke down or your draft animals died, you could be hundreds of miles from any help. You were completely on your own. This required pioneers to be multi-talented, becoming part carpenter, part blacksmith, doctor, cook, and guide. Improvising repairs, foraging for food, and protecting their families became daily responsibilities. Lack of thorough preparation meant facing the risk of losing everything. Every successful repair was a hard-won victory, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. The unpredictability of the terrain. The journey west was not only long, but also fraught with challenges from unpredictable and constantly changing terrain. Pioneers didn't travel on smooth, paved roads. Instead, they faced rough trails, often just rutted paths with no clear maps. Harsh weather could turn these trails into dangerous, muddy bogs. A heavy rain could leave an entire wagon train stuck deep in the mud, causing significant delays and requiring extraordinary effort to free themselves. Additionally, these trails wound around natural obstacles, through valleys, and over mountains, making the actual journey much longer than the direct route. Crossing mountain passes was one of the biggest challenges. Steep, rocky paths and cold mountain weather could reduce wagon speeds to just a few miles a day, or even a crawl. Wagons, which had no suspension, would constantly bounce and jolt over this terrain, causing extreme discomfort for passengers and increasing the risk of breakdowns. Each type of terrain presented its own unique challenge, requiring pioneers to constantly adapt and use their resourcefulness. The unpredictability of the terrain turned every day on the trail into an uncertain adventure, where a small mistake could lead to disaster. The financial burden of the trip. The journey west not only demanded physical and mental resilience, but was also a huge financial burden for pioneers. Most families were financially stretched thin to buy wagons, supplies, and provisions for the long journey. Owning a horse was simply too expensive for most pioneer families. Horses were not only costly to purchase initially, but also required significant maintenance and food expenses. Instead, they were forced to rely on mules and oxen, animals that were cheaper and easier to care for, even though they were slower and less glamorous. This demonstrates the harsh economic reality they faced. In addition to the initial costs for vehicles and draft animals, pioneers also had to pay fees along the way, such as ferry fees for river crossings. Although ferry services were available at major rivers, they were not cheap, and many could not afford them, forcing them to dangerously cross rivers on their own. Upon reaching their destination, many pioneers were financially exhausted, having spent their last pennies on the journey, even losing their wagons and possessions. This made starting a new life in the West incredibly difficult, as they had to rebuild everything from scratch, often in a state of hunger and illness. This financial burden forced pioneers to make difficult choices and frequently face deprivation, turning the dream of the promised land into a high-stakes gamble with large investments and high risks. Arriving wasn't always a happy ending. After 6 long months, facing countless dangers from terrain, weather, disease, and accidents, they finally saw their destination. The feeling of relief and happiness must have been immense. But the final brutal truth on this list is, arriving wasn't always a happy ending. Many pioneers arrived in a state of extreme destitution. Some had run out of food and were starving. Others were sick and exhausted after the long journey. Many were penniless, having lost their wagons, possessions, or spent their last coins on fees along the way. Imagine, after everything they'd been through, after surviving illness, accidents, river crossings, repairing wagons in the wilderness, they reached the promised land, with nothing left, completely exhausted, hungry, and sick. The dream of a new life still seemed very far away. Fortunately, early Oregon settlers often organized relief efforts. Charitable settlers would put together supply trains and meet the new arrivals at the Dalles, providing much-needed provisions and support for the final leg of the journey. This help was often the difference between life and death for those who had endured so much to reach their destination. While the westward journey was full of hardship, it also showed the compassion and generosity of those who had experienced similar difficult journeys and were willing to share with those who came after. And those are 20 brutal truths about life in covered wagons in the old American West. Clearly, it was no luxury vacation. It was a grueling test of endurance, a constant battle against the elements, and a gamble with fate every mile of the way. These pioneers faced unbelievable difficulties, but their determination blazed a trail westward, shaping the American West as we know it today. Was there anything in this video that surprised you the most? Or if you ever played the game Oregon Trail, what do you remember most from it? And how does it compare or contrast with the reality we just explored? Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. The brutal truth about stagecoach travel that Hollywood left out. Have you ever lost yourself in a classic Western movie, perhaps marveling at those magnificent stagecoaches? Hollywood paints a thrilling, adventurous, and often romantic picture. But what if I told you that Hollywood's depiction of stagecoach travel is mostly a fantasy, far from the exciting, sometimes seemingly comfortable journeys we see on screen? Today, we're going to peel back the cinematic romance to uncover the harsh, uncomfortable, and incredibly dangerous reality of 19th century stagecoach travel. You'll discover a world of toil and suffering, relentless discomfort, and threats that went far beyond a dramatic shootout. This video will give you a profound look into what our ancestors truly endured, and perhaps help you understand why the real story of stagecoach travel is even more compelling than the legends. Hollywood's frontier fantasy versus the cruel conveyance. When we think of stagecoach journeys, our minds are immediately drawn to captivating images from the big screen. Hollywood, with its storytelling prowess, has transformed the stagecoach into an icon of adventure and romance on the wild frontier. Think back to classics like John Ford's Stagecoach, where diverse characters, each with their own story, are brought together on a perilous adventure. In those films, the stagecoach itself often appears quite spacious, like a mobile stage, allowing characters to converse, interact, and for human drama to unfold. These cinematic journeys promise breathtaking suspense, daring chases, dramatic robberies, or moving moments of heroic sacrifice. The stagecoach isn't just a mode of transport, it becomes a mobile stage for human tragedy and triumph, where destinies intertwine, fiery confrontations take place, and stories of survival are written within its cramped confines. However, the brutal reality was a world away from the glamorous vision Hollywood painted. These films rarely depicted the persistent suffering, a harsh truth that most 19th century stagecoach passengers faced. Instead of focusing on the chronic misery caused by terrible road conditions, extreme and prolonged discomfort, pervasive dust, and the constant fear of illness and fatal accidents, Hollywood prioritized sudden ambushes and swift gunfights. The romanticization of stagecoach travel played a significant role in building the myth of a young, adventurous nation, transforming a symbol of arduous expansion into an emblem of rugged individualism and the pioneer spirit. But the truth is, the actual stagecoach experience was something modern people would find almost unbearable. It wasn't a scenic ride. It was a grueling physical and mental ordeal, a challenging journey that few of us today can fully imagine. Let's dive into those brutal details. The real perils of the prairie, beyond Hollywood's gunfights. Hollywood often focuses on epic shootouts, dramatic confrontations between heroes and villains. But in reality, the most frequent and often deadliest dangers were far more mundane. Accidents, mechanical breakdowns, and the grim reality of robbery. Accidents occurred with alarming frequency, wheels suddenly falling off, horses losing control and stampeding, or brakes failing, causing the coach to careen downhill. All were common sights on stagecoach routes. When a coach broke down mid-journey, passengers were often stranded in the middle of nowhere, waiting for help that might never arrive. The causes of these accidents were diverse, from unbelievably bad roads to mechanical failures like collapsed wheels or broken axles. Driver error was also a significant factor, such as speeding on dangerous terrain or being intoxicated while driving. Horses could also become unpredictable, suddenly spooking or becoming disobedient. And river crossings were always a hazard, with collapsed bridges or swift currents that could sweep away the entire coach. Among all these accidents, coach rollovers were perhaps the most dangerous aspect. With a high center of gravity and unstable construction, stagecoaches were very prone to overturning, especially when traveling on rough, steep, or sharp, curving roads. The consequences of a rollover were often severe injuries like broken bones, concussions, or even instant death. Many passengers never reached their destination due to these tragic accidents. Besides accidents, stagecoach robbery was also a constant threat. Wells Fargo coaches, one of the largest transport companies at the time, were robbed nearly 350 times between 1870 and 1884. Robbers often ambushed coaches at points where they had to slow down, such as on steep hills, around blind curves, or in narrow sections of road. The level of violence in robberies varied. Many robbers avoided killing to avoid more intense pursuit, but sometimes brutal murders still occurred. The main targets of robbers were treasure boxes containing gold, silver, and cash, along with mail bags, which often contained valuable documents and checks. Some famous robbers like Black Bart were known for their polite demeanor, sometimes leaving poems at the scene of the crime, while others were crude, uneducated, and brutal. To counter robberies, stagecoach companies implemented various security measures, including assigning heavily armed shotgun messengers to protect valuable cargo, and for particularly important shipments, even armored coaches to resist attacks. And we can't forget encounters with Native Americans, a complex aspect of history and cinema. Hollywood, with its aim to dramatize stories, created one of the most severe historical distortions. In films, Native Americans were often portrayed as cruel villains, constantly carrying out relentless, brutal, and unprovoked attacks on stagecoaches. However, the multi-dimensional reality was completely different. Attacks did occur and could be very frightening. Their danger cannot be denied. However, the motives for these attacks were often complex, not simply instinctive brutality. Native Americans might attack to steal horses or mules, which were extremely valuable assets to them. Or it could be an act of resistance against the encroachment of white settlers onto their ancestral lands. Sometimes, it was retaliation for violent or deceptive acts by white people, or simply to secure vital resources. In many cases, the damage was primarily to livestock and property, not passenger casualties. The frequency and nature of attacks were also often exaggerated or misattributed in folklore and films. Indeed, some crimes blamed on Native American tribes were actually carried out by white men in disguise to instill fear or serve their own purposes. While the fear of such encounters was real and completely justified for stagecoach travelers, understanding the historical context of land and resource dispossession is crucial, completely different from the simplistic savage Indian stereotypes Hollywood constructed. Nevertheless, contrary to Hollywood's romanticization, Native American stagecoach attacks did often occur in reality, not just in the fiction of novelists and filmmakers. Many attacks are documented, often targeting horses for property or revenge, not necessarily for monetary gain. These attacks could involve dramatic chases, similar to what we see in Hollywood films. For example, the attack on George H. Gittings's coach by 50 Mescalero Apaches in West Texas in 1854 led to a battle that lasted until sunset, wounding both passengers and horses. Another attack by Chiricahua Chief Cochise in 1861 killed the guide and driver, overturning the coach. A more horrifying attack in 1861 by 150 Apache warriors under Mangus Coloradas and Cochise left 4 dead in a makeshift fortification, with bodies stripped, arms broken, and heads full of bullets. Native Americans sometimes used clever ambush tactics, such as hiding behind sagebrush, to execute sudden and effective attacks. Attacks often caused significant loss of life and property, leading to heavy losses for stagecoach companies. However, it should be noted that in many cases, Native Americans often suffered more casualties than the better-armed defenders. Which of these stagecoach dangers, from accidents and illnesses to encounters with Native Americans, surprised you the most? Share your thoughts on what aspect of this reality Hollywood overlooked in the comments. Are we there yet? The torturous truth of the journey itself. The romantic image of a stagecoach gliding through picturesque landscapes across vast prairies or majestic mountains quickly fades when we confront the harsh reality of the journey itself. The main reason was the abysmal road conditions in the 19th century, which turned any trip into a true test of endurance. Roads in the American West were often just primitive dirt tracks, and they were entirely at the mercy of extreme weather. The rainy season would transform them into deeply rutted, muddy streams, causing wheels to get stuck and the coach to lurch endlessly. The dry season brought thick, pervasive clouds of dust, covering everything and everyone, making breathing difficult. When winter arrived, heavy snow could block all roads, making travel almost impossible. Another notorious type of road passengers endured was the corduroy road. Imagine logs laid side by side over muddy ground, creating an uneven and extremely bumpy surface. The great writer Charles Dickens, who experienced this type of road, described riding on such a road as causing jolts enough to dislocate all the bones. It's truly difficult to imagine the sensation of your entire body being thrown up, slammed down, and constantly battered for hours, even days, on end. And not only were the roads terrible, but the pace of travel was agonizingly slow, like crawling. An average stagecoach could only travel about 8 to 19 kilometers per hour, 5 to 12 miles per hour, on the best stretches of road. Sometimes, in difficult terrain, they only managed a mere 11 to 19 kilometers per day. Think about it. A journey that today takes us just a few hours by car could then last 3 full days by stagecoach. The consequence of this snail's pace, combined with the rough terrain, was continuous, relentless, violent motion. This led to total body exhaustion, bruises all over, and an unending sense of bone-deep weariness. This situation was made even worse by severe overcrowding. Passengers were crammed into the small interior compartment to the point where there wasn't an inch of space left. Additionally, mailbags piled inside not only took up space, but also became uncomfortable objects, hitting passengers every time the coach jolted. And most terrifying of all was the very little escape from the harsh external environment. Whether it was extreme heat scorching the skin, choking dust obscuring vision, biting cold, pouring rain drenching everything, or constant insect harassment, passengers had to endure it all. There was no air conditioning, no sealed windows, no air filtration system. They were completely exposed to the mercilessness of nature. One of the most horrifying aspects of long-distance stagecoach travel was the non-stop journey. Trips could last continuously for 22 days, day and night, without a single moment of true rest. Imagine a journey from St. Louis to San Francisco, one of the longest routes, taking about 25 arduous days. Throughout that time, passengers faced poor quality food and no proper sleep. Stops were usually very brief, primarily just to change fresh horses, allowing passengers enough time to stretch their legs a bit before continuing the journey. Sometimes, passengers were even forced to walk to lighten the load for tired horse teams, or had to get out and help push the coach up steep inclines. The entire journey was a constant assault on multiple senses, a physical and mental wearing down, pushing people to the limits of their endurance. After hearing about these terrible roads and slow speeds, what about the stagecoach journey surprised or disturbed you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Concorde discomfort. Coach built for endurance, not ease. When it comes to 19th century American stagecoaches, it's impossible not to mention the Concorde coach. This was the most iconic stagecoach, developed in the 1820s and quickly becoming the backbone of the overland transportation system. Its design was incredibly sturdy and reliable, to the point that it remained virtually unchanged for nearly 75 years. But don't let its durable appearance fool you, because durability did not mean comfort. A distinguishing feature of the Concorde coach was its innovative leather strap suspension system. Instead of rigid metal springs, the coach body was suspended on thick leather straps, allowing it to sway as it moved. This was supposed to provide a smoother ride than older coaches, especially on the relatively better roads in the eastern US. However, smooth here was a relative term, and this comfort virtually disappeared when the coach ventured onto the rough, bumpy trails of the Wild West. The famous writer Mark Twain, who experienced these journeys, even recounted a memorable anecdote. One of the suspension straps broke under the weight of heavy mail bags, proving the harshness of the journey. But what truly horrified passengers entering a Concorde coach was the terrible cramped space. Concorde coaches were typically designed to carry 6, 9, or 12 passengers inside. In reality, however, many more were often crammed in, with people even riding on the roof or clinging to the sides to find extra room. Inside, the space was incredibly tight. The passenger compartment was only slightly over 1.2 meters, about 4 feet, wide, and approximately 1.37 meters, about 4.5 feet, high. Imagine being squeezed shoulder to shoulder knee to knee with complete strangers in such a stuffy and suffocating space. Mark Twain, with his sharp satirical style, described passengers being mixed up a little by the swaying of the coach, finding themselves piled up in front. He also humorously recounted that sometimes passengers were actually standing on our heads due to the continuous and violent jolts of the coach. This illustrates the extreme chaos and discomfort passengers endured. To make matters worse, coaches in the West, especially those frequently facing extremely rough roads, had to replace glass windows with roll-down leather or canvas curtains. The reason was simple. The violent shaking constantly shattered the glass. This meant passengers had less protection from dust, rain, and extreme temperatures. On a long journey, being assaulted by swirling dust or enduring cold rain splashing on you was certainly an ordeal. Additionally, mail, a primary and important item transported by stagecoach companies, was often piled inside the passenger compartment, further reducing the already cramped space, making the experience even more suffocating and uncomfortable. The Concord coach, while a marvel of engineering for its time, relied heavily on the stamina and endurance of those who rode it. One traveler described being bounced now on the hard seat, now against the roof, and now against the side of the coach. He added that this was no joke, emphasizing the discomfort and pain each passenger experienced on every mile of the journey. This was not a mode of transport for relaxation or enjoying the scenery, but a machine that tested human endurance. The unspoken horrors, sanitation and sickness on the trail. Beyond the obvious discomforts of roads, coaches, and food, there were far more silent yet deadly horrors. The issues of personal hygiene and rampant disease on stagecoach journeys. First, let's talk about basic personal hygiene. Addressing personal needs was a significant and embarrassing challenge, as no restrooms were equipped on the stagecoach. When nature called, passengers could only relieve themselves by the roadside, with very little or almost no privacy. Throughout a long journey lasting days, sometimes weeks, personal hygiene became an unattainable dream. Facilities at the way stations were also extremely primitive. Personal washing was often done at horse troughs, afar from sanitary place. Worse yet, at one end of the trough, a shared cup, towel, and toothbrush were often provided for everyone. Imagine a single cup and toothbrush used by dozens, even hundreds of strangers every day, with no soap or clean water for disinfection. This left passengers in a significantly dirty state, not only their clothes and bodies, but also at high risk of disease transmission. But the most brutal, and also the #1 killer on the trails, was disease and serious illness. Sadly, disease caused the death of up to 9 out of 10 pioneers on overland journeys. Among these diseases, cholera was a terrifying, invisible destroyer. It spread primarily through contaminated water, which was very common given the poor sanitary conditions of way stations and water sources along the route. Cholera often led to rapid death due to severe dehydration, sometimes within just 24 hours of the first symptoms appearing. In addition to cholera, dysentery was also a common and severely debilitating illness. It caused bloody diarrhea and high fever, rapidly weakening the body. Other diseases that ravaged stagecoach travelers included typhoid fever, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, and mountain fever. All of these diseases spread easily in a crowded, unsanitary environment where passengers' bodies were weakened by the arduous journey. Clearly, crowded coaches and unsanitary stations were ideal breeding grounds for pathogens. Bacteria and viruses could spread rapidly from person to person in the confined space of the coach, or through the shared use of utensils and contaminated water sources at the way stations. What made the situation even more hopeless was that there was virtually no effective medical support along the way. Pioneers had to rely entirely on inadequate home remedies, often folk cures or superstitions, which were powerless against deadly diseases. Furthermore, understanding of germ theory in the 19th century was very limited. Doctors and the public often blamed diseases on miasmas or bad air rather than bacteria or viruses. This lack of scientific understanding rendered prevention and treatment measures ineffective, pushing passengers into a vicious cycle of sickness and death. Surviving the stops, way stations and refreshments. Against the backdrop of a prolonged and grueling journey, the brief stops at way stations should have been a welcome respite, an opportunity to rest and refuel. However, in reality, they offered very little true relief, and sometimes even added to the trip's discomfort. There were two main types of stations: swing stations and home stations. Swing stations were basic, as their name suggests, simply places to change fresh horses for the coach. Here, the stopover time was extremely brief, just enough for staff to unhitch the old horses and replace them with fresher ones. There was no time for passengers to rest or eat. Home stations were a bit more significant. They were often private homes or small inns, sometimes just makeshift shacks in the wilderness. Here, they served meals and provided crude lodging for passengers. However, even at these home stations, rest time was still very short. For example, the Butterfield Overland Mail stagecoach lines, one of the largest services at the time, stopped for a mere 10 minutes at each station. 10 minutes was not enough time to do anything but hastily get off the coach, try to grab some food, and then rush back on the road. The quality of the food at these stations was one of the most common complaints and a horror for most passengers. The proprietors, knowing that passengers had no other options, exploited their monopolistic position. They often served poor quality food, sometimes spoiled or carelessly cooked, but charged arbitrary, often very high prices. Granville Stewart, who endured many such journeys, bitterly lamented, "Every meal was the same." The typical menu was usually very bland and meager, consisting of hard bacon, dry ham, and a dreadful, almost inedible dry apple pie. There were no fresh vegetables, no truly nutritious or appealing dishes. For this reason, some wise and prepared passengers brought their own food to avoid facing these terrible meals. Hygiene was another major concern. Travelers, especially Victorians who were accustomed to higher hygiene standards, were appalled by the filthy and unsanitary conditions at the way stations. They were shocked by the careless attitude towards cleanliness from the innkeepers and cooks. There's a famous anecdote about a station cook who, after petting a dirty animal, immediately plunged his hands into biscuit dough to prepare a meal without washing them. When a passenger, unable to bear it, complained about dirt in the food, the innkeeper retorted curtly and rudely, "Everyone should eat a bushel of dirt." The dry-witted traveler replied that he didn't want to eat his entire ration in one meal. Such stories clearly show the horrific lack of hygiene and disrespect towards passengers. Accommodations at the way stations were also extremely primitive and lacking amenities. Women often had to crowd into a single room, with no privacy. Men had it even worse, often sleeping 2 to a bed, sometimes even 3 or 4 to a bed, with complete strangers. Beds were frequently filthy, infested with bed bugs, and not regularly cleaned. These stopping points, which should have offered rest, often became another layer of brutality in the journey, leaving passengers more uncomfortable and tired rather than refreshed. The human element. Passengers and crew. After all the harsh conditions and potential dangers, the human element, the psychology of passengers, social dynamics, and the lives of the crew, was a crucial part of the complete picture of the brutal reality of stagecoach travel. The mental and emotional burden on passengers was immense. They faced acute fear of attacks, accidents, or illness, keeping them in a constant state of high alert. Interspersed with the terror were long stretches of mind-numbingly monotonous and boring road, where the cramped space and repetitive scenery made time drag endlessly. Overarching it all was pervasive fatigue, a profound state of exhaustion from continuous non-stop movement, chronic sleep deprivation, poor food, and prolonged nervous tension. The awareness of ever-present dangers weighed heavily on their minds, making every moment a test of endurance. Social dynamics in this cramped space were also very unique. The forced intimacy in an extremely tight coach compartment with complete strangers, sometimes for days on end, often led to conflicts. To maintain order and minimize tension, major stagecoach companies like Wells Fargo had to establish strict rules of conduct for passengers. These rules were part of the unwritten laws for passengers to survive and coexist peacefully. Let's look at some interesting and sometimes humorous rules that clearly reflected reality. Share your liquor, a reminder of the importance of generosity and community spirit in difficult circumstances. Spit with the wind, a simple yet extremely necessary hygiene rule to avoid bothering fellow travelers. Don't snore on your companions. While it might sound funny, in a confined space, snoring could be a torment for others. Be courteous to women, emphasizing the need for social norms, especially when women were often a minority and vulnerable on these journeys. Keep calm in cases of runaway coaches. A practical piece of advice to avoid panic, which could worsen the situation. Specifically, the rules also advised, don't discuss politics or religion, topics prone to controversy and conflict. There was also advice to refrain from using profane language to maintain a civilized atmosphere in the coach. And a very notable rule was, don't point out locations where Native American attacks or stagecoach robberies occurred, to avoid instilling more fear and anxiety in passengers. These rules highlight the potential for disorder and the necessity of controlling behavior in the stressful environment of a stagecoach. Beyond the passengers, the lives of the stagecoach crew were also incredibly arduous and dangerous. Drivers, also known as whips, were respected for their skillful mastery of handling multiple horse teams on dangerous, challenging roads. However, they also faced constant danger, terribly long working hours, and often low pay. The pressure to keep the coach on schedule and safe was immense. Shotgun messengers were the protectors of valuable cargo, an extremely dangerous job as they were often the first targets of robbers. They had to ride on the roof of the coach or beside the driver, always ready for a fight. These individuals bore disproportionate risks compared to the meager rewards they received, often being the unsung heroes of the West. Finally, stagecoach passengers were a diverse cross-section of contemporary society. They came from all walks of life and professions: soldiers, clergy, scholars, servants, aristocrats, and even those seeking new fortunes. Although passengers contributed to revenue, mail and money were the main drivers, the lifeblood of stagecoach companies. People traveled for various reasons: business, migrating to new lands, seeking better health, or simply for the adventurous spirit of exploring the Wild West. Each passenger was a story, a piece in the larger tapestry of America's expansion. 19th century American stagecoach travel is a clear example of the chasm between popular myth and historical reality. Hollywood painted an exciting, romantic picture. Historical records reveal an experience that was incredibly brutal, immensely uncomfortable, dangerous, and horrifyingly unsanitary. The true story is one of incredible human endurance, of passengers and crew who bravely withstood unimaginable conditions. The extraordinary stamina required makes the westward expansion far more impressive than Hollywood's sanitized versions. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and want to learn more about American history, about stories that evoke memories, remember to subscribe to the channel and share Who Remembers with your history-loving friends. See you in the next video.